It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. After taking office, every president is required to table a national security strategy for the United States of America. Trump tabled his strategy on Monday in a speech he gave from the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. As usual, Trump spoke as if he was on campaign mode, putting down the previous Obama administration as disastrous and boasting about his own zeal.
They neglected a nuclear menace in North Korea, made a disastrous, weak, and incomprehensibly bad deal with Iran, and allowed terrorists such as ISIS to gain control of vast parts of territory all across the Middle East. But last year, all of that began to change. The American people rejected the failures of the past. On January 20th, 2017, I stood on the steps of the Capitol to herald the day the people became the rulers of their nation again.
On to talk about this with me is Vijay Prashad. He is the Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and is also Chief Editor of Leftward Books. Vijay is the author of more than 18 books, among them The Death of a Nation and The Future of the Arab Revolution. Good to have you back here, Vijay.
Thanks.
Vijay, give us the broad strokes here of the Trump's national security strategy speech on Monday.
Well, I listened to the speech, but I also read the national security strategy document, 66 pages of it, longer than I remember these documents from the Obama or Bush years. I found the document, more than the speech, to be quite powerful in one respect. It actually comes out and says some quite bold things, however incoherent the concepts might be. This is a very bold document. Some of the things that Mr. Trump said in his speech, I think, are not tenable, and also perhaps a little exaggeration. It's not something to be surprised by. He said that he was the first to put economic security in a national security document. This is not true. Economic security has been part of these documents for a very long time. But the most important aspect here is, I think, what they call principled realism. And by this principled realism, what they mean, I think, is that the United States should no longer see Russia and China as partners in a global enterprise, but the United States should see Russia and China as adversaries. As rivals, as threats to U.S. dominance in the world order. And secondly, if Russia and China are the main threats, North Korea and Iran are secondary threats, the next level of threat, perhaps regional threats. This is a new architecture of the world. The United States now, I think, recognizes that it is not first among equals, that new or older powers have emerged to share the stage alongside the United States. And so, in a way, unlike the documents produced by the Obama and Bush administration, this is the first defensive document that I've seen, and a document that, from a position of defensiveness, what they call principled realism, argues that the United States needs to rebuild its military and use mostly military power to challenge the rise of China and Russia.
Vijay, let's set aside China and Russia for now, because lately there's been a lot of focus on Iran in Washington, especially regarding what they claim, which is non-compliance with the nuclear deal and needing to take bold action. So last week we had Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, at a press conference standing in front of what she called a debris from a rocket ship that was going from Yemen to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, and she presented this as evidence that Iranian-made rockets were being shot by Houthis in Yemen towards Saudi Arabia. Now, this particular press conference, was likened to Colin Powell's speech at the UN about Iraq, where he held a tube up, if you remember, as evidence of weapons of mass destruction that was being developed in Iraq. Now, how did Iran fare in this strategy, given this background before the speech?
Well, the interesting thing is the obsession with Iran continues, despite the fact that I think the interagency groups that put this document together, understand that Iran plays a very complicated role in the Middle East. Mr. Trump doesn't see the complexity. He takes, I think, the right-wing Israeli position on Iran rather than a realist position on Iran. They see Iran, or the Israelis and Mr. Trump see Iran as an existential threat that needs to be destroyed, rather than a country of 80, 90 million that lives in West Asia, in that neighborhood, and must therefore have a role in that neighborhood. The question for Mr. Trump and the Israelis is not what kind of role Iran should have, a productive role that it should have in the neighborhood, that it should, in a sense, cease to exist. In that sense, Mr. Trump is not being a principled realist, but is being, I think, an idealist, and an idealist of the worst kind. In other words, a genocidal idealist who believes that Iran can either be destroyed or that it can be entirely silenced. This is a fantasy of the American right and the Israelis, which even this document doesn't sustain. This document speaks more about containing Iran rather than destroying Iran.
Let's shift gears here, Vijay. At the core of Trump's speech, he outlined 4 pillars. And one of these pillars was about immigration. Let's listen.
First, we must protect the American people, the homeland, and our great American way of life. This strategy recognizes that we cannot secure a nation if we do not secure our borders. So for the first time ever, American strategy now includes a serious plan to defend our homeland. It calls for the construction of a wall on our southern border, ending chain migration and the horrible visa and lottery programs, closing loopholes that undermine enforcement, and strongly supporting our Border Patrol agents, ICE officers, and Homeland Security personnel.
Now, framing anti-immigration policies as a national security risk is obviously dangerous, but it's to appeal to the extreme right here, and of course extreme right in Europe as well. Now, isn't it dangerous to go down this road?
Well, it's not that this kind of thing hasn't been in an important strategic document before. This was the kind of language that one heard in the 1980s as well. But let's leave that aside and come to the heart of it, which is to say that if you were actually going to be a principled realist, which is their claim, you would look, I think, at the real world. And in the real world, one would see that a great deal of the so-called innovation sector of the American economy has happened through immigration. You've allowed into your big universities highly skilled people from Asia, from India, from China, from West Africa and Southern Africa, from Latin America, very skilled people from the former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. And they have produced an immense advantage to the United States in the way of intellectual property rights and so on, and patents, which are the part of the engine of the American economic model for the last 35 years. So 2 things seem to undermine this in Mr. Trump's policy framework. One is this view that immigrants are a problem, which is all over this document. And the second is the attack on higher education in the new tax bill, which suggests that students who get any kind of grant, money that they don't see must be taxed on that grant. This is going to discourage highly educated migrants from coming into the United States, and indeed one has seen that already taking place. So on the one side, there is this attack on migrants, an attack on higher education, an attack on the sectors in American economy that have produced the kind of GDP growing innovation. On the other side, there's this claim that somehow the American economy must become secure, and that you can only have national security if you have economic security. It's not clear to me how these two things are going to be balanced. This is one of, I think, the important incoherences of the Trump agenda. This attack on immigrants on the one side, which will have immediate and short-term repercussions to economic growth in the United States. And secondly, this idea that you can produce economic security by itself. How are you going to produce the kind of innovations needed by this accumulation strategy of the last 30 years if you've been desiccating, secondary education in the United States? You're not allowing talent to emerge from there. You're having to import talent. This has been the model that the United States has utilized for the last 35 odd years. And I don't see how this Trump document is going to produce both economic security and border security and not find these two to be in deep contradiction with each other.
Vijay, let's hear the second pillar of this new strategy.
The second pillar of our strategy is to promote American prosperity. For the first time, American strategy recognizes that economic security is national security. Economic vitality, growth, and prosperity at home is absolutely necessary for American power and influence abroad. Any nation that trades away its prosperity for security will end up losing both.
Now, of course, Trump is paraphrasing the famous statement by Benjamin Franklin about giving up liberty for the sake of security and losing both. Now, Trump's idea of prosperity is to talk about the tax cut and how it's going to benefit us all. And of course, the stock market, how well it's doing, the prosperity in the market. Explain this to us.
Well, it's interesting that there'll be an enormous hole in the national budget. This will have impact on long-term debt in the United States. This tax cut that they are proposing, this big hole in long-term debt is going to have to be serviced by somebody. Who is going to be buying American bonds? Who is going to be covering the balance of payments of the United States? History has shown us, that is recent history, that the people who've covered this debt are the major oil and gas producing countries, Saudi Arabia, for instance, and China. China has played a very important role in covering the national debt, and helping, in a sense, the United States balance its budget. So on the one side, you have this big hole created in the national debt, a larger hole, a gaping hole, which now we expect China to fill. And on the other side, this document has proposed that China is the principal, great power rival of the United States. A chief economist at the IMF about 5-6 years ago called this a satanic relationship between the United States and China. There's a very strange way in which China produces low-end goods bought by the American consumer, who are able to only buy this because the Chinese essentially, through credit networks, are forwarding money to the American public to buy goods made in China. This is the kind of satanic cycle between China and the United States. So, you're going to create this major national debt problem. China is going to help you cover that debt, and yet you're going to have an adversarial relationship against China. This seems much more to me to be theater to Mr. Trump's base than a real policy with, I think, legs for the US government agencies to walk on.
Now let's hear the third pillar of Trump's national security plan, which is about peace through strength.
The third pillar of our strategy is to preserve peace through strength. we recognize that weakness is the surest path to conflict, and unrivaled power is the most certain means of defense. For this reason, our strategy breaks from the damaging defense sequester. We're going to get rid of that.
Now, of course, it begs the question, what kind of strength is the U.S. still lacking, having the ability to destroy the human race with nuclear weapons and already spending so much on defense? Give me your take on this effort.
Well, look, the United States has been basically permanently at war since 1941. I mean, there has been no period from 1941 to the present when the US government hasn't been at a declared or undeclared war somewhere on the planet. So I don't see how this idea of peace through strength is a new concept. This is a fundamental principle of US foreign policy and the US government. The United States, since at least the end of the Cold War, has been miles away from any other country in terms of military spending, in terms of the size of the US military. In fact, the amount that the Trump administration proposes to increase the US military budget by, those tens of billions of dollars, is the total military budget of Russia. Coming up to somewhere around $600–700 billion of military spending a year dwarfs the militaries of all the countries in the world. It's not clear to me how this is any different than the policy previously. But Mr. Trump did make a statement which I think bears some reflection. He said that the United States should not go into wars if it doesn't want to win them. This raises, I think, should raise some concerns around the world. It's not clear, again, what he means by winning wars. Does he mean that when the United States went into Iraq, it should have bombed the Iraqi cities harder in order to break the will of any resistance? Does he imply that he would use nuclear weapons essentially to shut down the capacity of a society to resist against American power? I mean, what does he say when he says that the United States should not go into a war if it is not willing to win that war? The United States hasn't, as it were, won a war in a very long time. There was no victory in Vietnam. There was no real victory in Iraq. There's no victory in Libya. These are not winnable wars. So does he propose to use even more military force than his predecessors? I think listening to that statement, the world should let out a collective shudder.
And now let's have a quick listen to the fourth pillar, and this is the final pillar in his speech on domestic versus foreign policy.
Fourth and finally, our strategy is to advance American influence in the world. But this begins with building up our wealth and power at home.
Now here he's repeating the emphasis he's had throughout the speech, domestic policy over foreign policy. That is why he's withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, declining to ratify the Iran nuclear deal, and rejecting TPP. What do you make of this kind of isolationist policy of Trump?
Well, it's important to recognize that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was pushed by the United States government. I mean, Mr. Obama's statement, I think, is a very clear statement. He said on the record that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was to prevent China from writing the rules of world trade. That was the express purpose of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So by pulling out of the TPP, of course, Mr. Trump has given China free rein in most of Asia to conduct its own bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, including the Silk Road project. And there appears to be no US attempt to block that, perhaps because there isn't any way to block the Silk Road project or China's bilateral agreements in Asia. The other Asian countries are quite happy to have close relations with China on trade. And there is no appetite really to have a kind of adversarial relationship against China. This was something that the TPP was something that countries came on board because of intense diplomacy from the Obama administration, not because this was something that even countries like Singapore were focused upon. So that's one issue, that the United States under Trump has indeed walked away from multilateral agreements, has I think come to the understanding that it will push bilateral agreements more than multilateral agreements. This is a view that was also there in the Obama administration. To be fair to Mr. Trump, he's not pioneering this approach. But secondly, and I think this is where there is some, I think, should be some concern within the United States. You know, this idea that you need to build economic strength within the country, this is a fair statement to make. You know, no national leader should neglect the very population that they are being elected to serve. But when Mr. Trump speaks of America first, it's not clear that he's talking about the American population. I think here the tax bill is very educative, that he's speaking more about the very uber elites of the United States rather than the American population, because there is no real agenda. There is no congressional calendar that says that infrastructure building is going to be a major emphasis of this administration. There is nothing on the congressional calendar that shows that improving the schooling and health of ordinary Americans is going to be high on the agenda. They immediately went for tax reform, which is going to benefit a very small section of the American public, that is the uber rich. So there's no sense that this America First slogan actually means the American people. It basically means the American elite, American arms dealers, and people of that ilk.
Right. And finally, Vijay, in looking forward to 2018, what do you expect that this speech, contains that will be projected across the world in the coming year?
Well, what I would like to see, frankly, is the Russians, the Chinese, other important powers in the world, call for a special conference of the United Nations to discuss the kind of belligerent warmongering coming from Washington, D.C. One, again, incoherence in the document, the strategy document produced by the Trump administration, is that it focuses attention on China, calling it a rival. On the other hand, its entire strategy to deal with North Korea is premised on an alliance with China. So I think that this warmongering around the Korean Peninsula, around Iran and so on, should be enough of an impetus for countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, China, perhaps the European Union, to call for a special session of the United Nations to have a serious discussion about belligerence, about arms spending in the world. We've seen that since the fall of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, arms spending is at rates much higher than it was even at the highest point of the Cold War. So I would like to see these countries call for a special session to have a serious global dialogue about this out-of-control rhetoric coming from Washington and the out-of-control military spending coming from many capitals around the planet.
All right, Vijay, I thank you so much for joining us today, and all the best to you in 2018.
Yes, Happy New Year.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.